The morning she finally snapped started quietly, the way winter mornings always do when the snow has settled overnight and the neighborhood feels like it's holding its breath. I remember standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, watching my breath fog the glass as the sun crept over the rooftops. Out in the front yard, right where the sidewalk curved toward the street, stood the snowman my daughter and I had rebuilt the night before. He was lopsided, a little uneven, and absolutely perfect. His stick arms pointed in opposite directions, like he couldn't decide whether to wave hello or surrender. I didn't see her at first. I heard her. The low growl of an engine being pushed harder than it needed to be echoed between the houses. Then I saw her SUV roll into view, slowing just enough to line up with the curb. She stopped. For a second, everything froze, me at the window, the snowman in the yard, the air itself. Then her engine revved, hard. She didn't swerve. She didn't hesitate. She floored it straight through the snowman. There was a sound that wasn't snow. A sharp, ugly crunch followed by a metallic thud that made my stomach drop. Her SUV jolted, lurched forward and died halfway across my yard. Steam hissed into the cold air. Alarms started screaming. I remember thinking, very calmly, that this was going to change everything. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the snowman wasn't just snow anymore. If you'd asked me a year earlier how something like this could happen, I would have laughed. We didn't move to Willow Ridge Estates looking for conflict. We moved there because we were tired. Tired of noise, tired of uncertainty, tired of feeling like the ground could shift under our feet at any moment. After the divorce, it felt like my life had been broken into pieces I didn't quite know how to put back together. All I knew was that my daughter needed stability, and I needed a place where we could breathe again. Willow Ridge looked like that place. Neat houses, trimmed lawns, quiet streets. The listing photos showed kids riding bikes and families waving to each other from porches. There was an HOA, sure, but at the time that sounded like a small price to pay for safety and order. The realtor called it well managed. I didn't ask too many questions. I just wanted somewhere my daughter could feel safe enough to smile again. The first few weeks were exactly what we'd hoped for. She picked out her room and insisted on painting one wall light blue so it feels like the sky. We unpacked slowly, turning boxes into furniture and routines into rituals. Every evening we walked the block together, counting porch lights and waving at neighbors. People smiled back, but there was a stiffness to it I didn't notice at first. I thought they were just reserved. The first time I met her, it was over something small. I was unloading groceries when I noticed a woman standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard tucked against her chest like a shield. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched me struggle with a bag until I finally looked up. "You're new," she said. Not a question. I nodded, introduced myself, told her we'd just moved in. "I'm the HOA president," she replied. "Brenda." She said it like a title, not a name. Then she glanced past me, her eyes scanning my yard as if she were already taking inventory. She mentioned something about trash cans needing to be fully concealed after pickup. I told her no problem. She nodded once, sharp and final, and walked away without another word. It was strange, but I brushed it off. Every neighborhood has someone who takes things a little too seriously. I didn't realize then that she wasn't just serious, she was watching. The first notice came a week later, a formal envelope taped to my door, complete with letterhead and fine print. It said my garbage can had been visible for 37 minutes past the allowable window. There was a fine attached, not huge but enough to sting. I paid it and moved on. I told myself it was a learning curve. Then came the decorations. My daughter had hung a handmade wreath on the door, construction paper, glitter, the works. She was proud of it in a way only kids can be proud of things adults might overlook. 2 days later, there was another notice. The colors weren't seasonally appropriate. Another fine. I tried to explain. Brenda listened without blinking and told me rules were rules. The snow came early that year, thick and heavy, the kind that sticks to everything and turns the world quiet. My daughter practically vibrated with excitement. We bundled up and went outside before breakfast, our boots crunching through fresh powder. The snowman started as a joke, then turned into a project. We rolled the snow into uneven balls, laughed when one collapsed, tried again. She gave him a scarf and insisted he needed a family. When we finished, she stepped back and smiled in that way that made everything else feel manageable. For the first time in months, she looked completely unburdened. That afternoon, I found the snowman smashed, not melted, not fallen, kicked apart, the pieces scattered like someone had gone out of their way to make sure it couldn't be put back together. There was a notice waiting for me. Obstruction of common sight lines, safety hazard, remove immediately. I remember my daughter standing beside me, her gloves hanging limp at her sides, staring at the mess. She didn't cry. She just asked why someone would do that. I didn't have an answer. We rebuilt it the next day. Smaller this time, tucked closer to the house. It didn't last the night. This time, I saw the tire tracks, clear as day, cutting through the snow where the yard met the street. They stopped just short of the porch. When I confronted Brenda, she smiled in a way that never reached her eyes. She said she had no idea what I was talking about, but reminded me that repeated violations could lead to increased penalties. She spoke slowly, carefully, like she was explaining something to a child. Around us, neighbors pretended not to listen. Curtains twitched. Doors stayed closed. Later, one of them caught me while I was checking the mail and whispered that I should just give up. That she'd been like this for years, that pushing back only made things worse. That was when I realized this wasn't random. This wasn't about snowmen or rules. It was about control. Every interaction after that carried a weight I hadn't felt before. Brenda showed up more often, always with her clipboard, always watching. She cited things no one else seemed to get cited for. The chalk drawings on the sidewalk, a toy left out overnight, things that existed only because a child lived there. The snowman became a line she kept crossing, and each time she did, something in me shifted. I stopped feeling surprised. I stopped feeling confused. I started paying attention. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that rebuilding the same snowman and hoping for a different outcome wasn't working. And as I stood at the window that morning, watching her SUV sit disabled in my yard, alarms blaring into the cold air, I understood something very clearly. This moment didn't start today. It started the first time she decided that crushing a little bit of joy was acceptable. After that morning, the neighborhood felt different, even before anything officially changed. It was like everyone could sense the tension building, even if they didn't know why. I went through the motions of daily life, work, school drop-offs, dinners, but there was a new layer of awareness underneath it all. Every time I stepped outside, I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, deliberate way that made it worse. Brenda didn't stop after the snowman incidents. If anything, she became more precise. The notices started arriving more frequently, each one documenting something so minor it felt surreal. A planter that was 2 inches too close to the walkway, a porch light that stayed on past the recommended hour. The wording was always polite, always formal, always absolute. There was never any room for explanation. What stood out was how personal it felt. I began noticing that other houses had the same things I was being cited for. Their trash cans were out, their lights were on, their decorations stayed up, but nothing happened to them. No envelopes, no fines, no visits from Brenda with her clipboard. The difference was obvious, even if no one said it out loud. Those houses belonged to families that fit neatly into Brenda's idea of the neighborhood. 2 parents, older kids, predictable routines. Mine didn't. The chalk drawings were the next flashpoint. My daughter loved chalk because it disappeared. It felt safe to her, temporary and harmless. She drew flowers, hearts, misspelled words she was proud of anyway. One afternoon she covered a small square of sidewalk in front of our house with a picture of our snowman, complete with a crooked smile. By evening, it was gone, not washed away by weather, but scrubbed clean so aggressively that the concrete looked lighter in that spot. A notice followed the next morning, unauthorized markings on communal property. Another fine. When I asked Brenda why chalk drawings were suddenly a problem, she told me they encouraged loitering. Loitering. On our own sidewalk. That was the moment I realized how carefully she chose her language. Everything sounded reasonable if you didn't think about it too hard. Safety, standards, liability, words that shut down arguments before they could start, words that made people feel foolish for even questioning her. My daughter stopped drawing with chalk after that. She didn't say why. She just put the box back in the garage and didn't ask for it again. The snowmen kept coming back, though, smaller each time, quieter, almost defiant in their simplicity, sometimes just 2 stacked balls with a stick for a nose, sometimes no face at all, just proof that we were still there, and ever. Each time, they were destroyed. Once, I caught Brenda in the act. I was coming home early from work and saw her standing in my yard, boot pressed against the base of the snowman. She froze when she saw me, then slowly lifted her foot away as if she'd been caught stepping on a crack in the sidewalk. "This is a safety issue," she said immediately, before I could speak. "Children could trip." I looked at the empty street, the wide yard, the snowman tucked well away from the sidewalk. I asked her how long she'd been concerned about children tripping in my yard. She stared at me, expression unreadable, then wrote something down on her clipboard. "I'll note your hostility," she said. "That can be relevant later." After that, she didn't bother hiding it. The tire tracks became more obvious, the destruction more thorough. Once, she knocked the snowman down and left the scarf hanging from the mailbox like a warning. Neighbors started approaching me in small, careful ways. A woman 2 houses down slipped a note into my mailbox saying she was sorry. An older man across the street nodded at me more firmly than usual, like he was trying to communicate something without words. No one confronted Brenda. No one challenged her publicly, but I could feel their discomfort growing. At a community meeting, Brenda stood at the front of the room and talked about maintaining standards with a smile that never wavered. She clicked through slides showing examples of violations. One of them was my house, my front yard, my snowman circled in red. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. I raised my hand and asked why certain rules seemed to be enforced selectively. The room went quiet. Brenda tilted her head and said enforcement was based on reports and observations. When I asked who was reporting chalk drawings and snowmen, she said that information was confidential. After the meeting, a few people avoided my eyes. One man patted my shoulder and told me to hang in there. Another whispered that Brenda had done this before, that she picked someone and pushed until they either moved or broke. That night, I lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house and wondering how something so small had turned into this. How a snowman had become a battleground. The fines started stacking up. Individually, they were manageable. Together, they were exhausting. Each one came with a warning about escalation. Repeated violations could lead to hearings. Hearings could lead to penalties. Penalties could lead to liens. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about pressure, about reminding me that she could reach into every part of my life if she wanted to. She proved it one afternoon when I got a notice about my work truck. It was parked in my driveway, exactly where it had been every day since we moved in. The notice claimed it violated residential appearance standards. I checked the rules. Commercial vehicles were allowed, as long as they weren't oversized. Mine wasn't. When I pointed this out, Brenda told me the board had discretion. That word again, elastic, convenient, dangerous. My daughter noticed the changes before I realized how obvious they'd become. She asked why I was always checking the mailbox, why I looked tense when a car slowed near the house, why we didn't build snowmen anymore. I told her it was just too cold lately. I hated myself for lying, but I didn't know how to explain that an adult had decided her joy was inconvenient. The worst part wasn't the destruction, it was the predictability. I could feel Brenda waiting, watching for opportunities. Every interaction felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. That was when I started paying closer attention to her routines. The times she drove through the neighborhood, the way she slowed near certain houses and sped past others. The way her notices always appeared early in the morning, as if she liked being the first intrusion of the day. I also started noticing something else, patterns in who got fined and who didn't, single parents, elderly residents, people who kept to themselves, people who didn't attend meetings or push back, people who were easy to isolate. The snowman wasn't the cause of her behavior, it was the excuse. One evening, as I stood in the driveway brushing snow off my car, a neighbor I barely knew stopped across the street and asked how my daughter was doing. He didn't mention the HOA, he didn't mention Brenda, but the way he asked told me everything. This wasn't invisible, it was just unchallenged. That night, after my daughter went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of notices spread out in front of me. I read them slowly, looking for consistency, for logic, for anything that made sense. Instead, I found contradictions. Rules cited that didn't apply. Language that shifted from one notice to the next. For the first time, I stopped reacting and started thinking. If this were really about rules, there would be clear lines. There weren't. If this were about safety, there would be warnings before penalties. There weren't. If this were about community, there would be conversation. There wasn't. It was about leverage. The next snowfall came quietly, late at night. I watched it through the window as flakes drifted down, softening the edges of everything. My daughter asked if we could build another snowman. I hesitated, then said yes. We built it together, slower this time. No scarf, no face. Just a simple shape, standing there like a question. As we went inside, she asked if it would still be there in the morning. I told her I didn't know. What I didn't tell her was that for the first time, I wasn't rebuild. Out of hope, I was rebuilding to see what would happen next. The snowman was gone by morning. Not scattered this time, not stomped into pieces, just gone, as if it had never existed at all. The patch of yard where it had stood was scraped down to the grass, the snow pushed aside in a clean, deliberate arc. It was almost surgical. Whoever did it hadn't been angry. They'd been careful. That was the moment something clicked for me. Anger leaves mess, control leaves patterns. I didn't say anything to my daughter when she noticed the empty spot. I just told her we'd build another one later, when it snowed again. She nodded, but there was a hesitation there now. A pause that hadn't existed before. The unspoken question wasn't whether the snowman would last. It was whether it was worth building at all. After she went to school, I walked the property slowly, like I was seeing it for the first time. The yard, the sidewalk, the street. I tried to imagine what Brenda saw when she drove by, clipboard on the seat beside her. I wasn't looking for damage anymore. I was looking for consistency. That afternoon, I bought a cheap notebook and started writing things down. Dates, times, what the notices said, what they cited, where Brenda was when she issued them. I didn't know exactly why I was doing it yet. I just knew that reacting wasn't working, and neither was hoping. The more I wrote, the more the pattern sharpened. Violations weren't evenly spaced. They clustered. They followed interactions. If I questioned her at a meeting, a notice appeared within 48 hours. If my daughter had friends over, something would be wrong with the yard the next day. If I stayed quiet for a week, things went calm. Not because the rules were suddenly being followed, but because the pressure was being applied strategically. I started taking photos. Nothing dramatic, just wide shots, time. Stamped images of the yard, the sidewalk, the street. I photographed my trash cans next to my neighbors, their decorations next to mine. I didn't send the photos to anyone. I just kept them. It felt strange at first, like I was doing something wrong, like documenting my own home was somehow crossing a line. But the longer I paid attention, the clearer it became that someone else had crossed it long ago. The first neighbor to really talk to me was an older woman named Cecilia, who lived at the end of the block. She knocked on my door one evening while I was making dinner and stood there twisting her gloves in her hands like she wasn't sure she should be there. "I saw what happened to your snowman," she said quietly. I told her it wasn't a big deal. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "It is," she said. "It always starts small." She didn't stay long, but before she left, she told me something that stuck. She said Brenda had fined her for having a bench on her porch that was encouraging gathering. The bench had been there for 15 years. She'd taken it inside and never put it back. After that, more people started finding reasons to talk to me. Brief conversations while checking the mail, quick comments while walking dogs. Always careful, always looking over their shoulders. They shared stories that sounded eerily familiar. Notices for things that had never been a problem before. fines that appeared after disagreements, warnings that escalated without explanation. One neighbor showed me a notice he'd received for having his garage door open too long. Another told me she'd been cited for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list, even though the list hadn't been updated in years. None of them wanted to be the one to push back. They'd all tried, in small ways. It never ended well. At night, after my daughter went to bed, I start reading the HOA documents more closely, not skimming them like I had when we moved in, but actually reading them. The bylaws, the covenants, the fine schedules. I printed things out and highlighted sections that didn't seem to line up with the notices I'd received. That was when I noticed how often the word may appeared. The board may issue fines. The board may escalate enforcement. The board may use discretion. Everything was flexible. Everything depended on interpretation. Discretion sounds harmless until you realize who gets to use it. I also noticed something else. There were procedures outlined for warnings, for hearings, for appeals. I hadn't received any warnings. I hadn't been offered any hearings. Appeals were technically available, but the instructions were vague, and the board that would hear them was the same board Brenda presided over. It wasn't designed to be challenged. It was designed to be endured. The snow fell again a few days later, light and steady. My daughter watched it from the window and didn't ask to go outside. That hurt more than any fine. I told her we could build something if she wanted. She shrugged and said maybe later, so I built it alone. It wasn't much, just a small mound near the same spot as before. I didn't decorate it. I didn't take photos. I just watched it from the window as evening settled in. It lasted until midnight. I didn't confront Brenda this time. I didn't send emails or make phone calls. I wrote down the time it disappeared. I noted the tire tracks again, the angle, the direction. I added it to the notebook. The next notice came the following morning. This one cited repeated non-compliance and mentioned possible further action. It was worded carefully, but the message was clear. She wasn't done. For the first time, though, I felt oddly calm, because something else had become clear too. Brenda wasn't improvising anymore. She was reacting. The snowman had become a trigger, not because it violated any rule, but because it reminded her that she hadn't completely won. As long as it kept appearing, she had to keep responding. And the more she responded, the more visible her behavior became. I installed a small camera by the front window. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It pointed at my own yard and nothing else. I made sure it was legal. I checked twice. Then I added another, angled slightly differently. Still nothing dramatic, just coverage. When Brenda noticed, her reaction was immediate. The next notice mentioned unauthorized surveillance equipment. I responded in writing, calmly citing the section of the bylaws that allowed security cameras. She didn't reply. But she did drive by more often after that. Neighbors noticed the cameras too. A few asked about them. I told them the truth. I said I was tired of guessing, that I wanted clarity. Some of them nodded like that made perfect sense. Others looked nervous, like clarity was a dangerous thing. One evening, as I was bringing groceries inside, a man named Raj from 2 streets over introduced himself. He said he worked in data analysis. He said he'd noticed patterns in the HOA enforcement too. He asked if I was documenting things. I showed him the notebook. He didn't smile. He just nodded slowly and said, "Good." Over the next week, he and a few others shared their records with me. Photos, emails, notices going back years. When we laid them out together, the pattern wasn't just clear, it was undeniable. Certain houses appeared again and again, certain names, certain types of violations that seemed to exist only on paper. The snowman was just the most visible example. That was when I stopped thinking of this as a personal problem and started seeing it as a system. Brenda relied on isolation, on people feeling like it was just happening to them, on embarrassment and fatigue doing the work for her. As soon as documentation entered the picture, that system started to strain. I didn't tell my daughter any of this. To her, things stayed simple. School, homework, dinner. I protected that as best I could, but I also closer attention to what she noticed, how she avoided the front yard, how she stopped asking about chalk. That's what finally pushed me from observation to decision. One night, after she went to bed, I stood in the yard and looked at the empty patch where the snowman used to stand. I thought about how predictable Brenda had become, how every snowman drew her in, how she couldn't leave it alone, and I realized something else. If she was going to keep coming onto my property to destroy something harmless, then the snowman wasn't just a target anymore, it was leverage. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet. I just knew I wasn't going to keep rebuilding the same thing and expecting mercy. I was done playing defense, done hoping she'd get bored, done assuming reason would suddenly matter. The next snowman would look the same as the others. Simple, innocent, unremarkable. But it wouldn't be built the same way. As I went back inside and turned off the porch light, I wrote one last line in the notebook before closing it. Next time, I wait. The next snowfall didn't come right away. Days passed, then a week, and the yard stayed bare and brown, like it was holding its breath along with me. I didn't rush anything. That was the hardest part, waiting without reacting, letting the quiet stretch. Brenda drove by less often at first, then more. Slow passes, lingering looks. Once she stopped across the street and sat there with the engine running for a full minute before driving off. She was waiting for the snowman. I kept everything else normal. Too normal. Trash cans went in exactly on time. The porch stayed immaculate. No decorations, no chalk, no toys left out. If she was looking for an excuse to act, I wasn't giving her one. The only thing that changed was what people couldn't see. At night, after my daughter went to bed, I double-checked paperwork. Proppert. Why boundaries? HOA language, city ordinances. I didn't rely on assumptions. I verified everything. I made sure that anything I did stayed firmly on my side of the line, legally, ethically, visibly. If Brenda was going to make a mistake, it had to be hers alone. The cameras stayed in place. They became part of the scenery, like porch lights or mailboxes. Neighbors got used to them. Brenda didn't. She started parking farther away when she drove by, like distance might somehow protect her from being seen. When the snow finally returned, it came overnight, thick and quiet. I woke up early before my alarm and stood at the window watching it fall. The world looked clean again, reset in that way only snow can manage. I felt calm in a way I hadn't in months. My daughter padded into the kitchen in her socks and asked if we could build one again. I said yes. We didn't rush. We ate breakfast first. We bundled up slowly. She laughed when the cold hit her cheeks and ran ahead to the yard. I followed, rolling the snow the way we always had. Same spot, same shape, same careless imperfections that made it look like something a child had built, not a statement. To anyone watching, it was just another snowman. That was the point. I made sure it didn't look special. No accessories, no decorations, nothing that would make it stand out. When we were done, my daughter stepped back, looked at it, and smiled. Not the wide, fearless smile from before, but something softer. Hopeful, maybe, cautious. "Do you think it'll stay?" she asked. I told her I didn't know, and for the first time that wasn't a lie. The snowman stood there all day, through lunch, through the afternoon, through the early evening when the sky turned grey and the streetlights flickered on. Brenda drove by twice. The first time she slowed, then kept going. The second time she stopped at the corner and stared straight. Tea ahead, like she didn't want to be caught looking. I didn't look back. That night nothing happened. I slept lightly, half expecting the sound of tires or boots or something being knocked over. The cameras stayed quiet. The snowman stayed standing. When morning came and it was still there, I felt a strange flicker of disappointment. Because I knew this wasn't over, it was just delayed. Over the next few days, the snowman became a fixture. Neighbors walked past it. Some smiled. One woman paused and took a photo of her kid next to it. Brenda drove by every day, sometimes more than once. Each time she slowed. Each time she didn't stop. The waiting changed the rhythm of everything. Instead of reacting to her, I watched her. Instead of bracing for the next notice, I checked the cameras and the notebook and went about my day. The power dynamic shifted quietly, like weight moving from one foot to the other. Then the notices started again. Not about the snowman, about everything else. A light left on too late. A car parked at a slight angle. Things that hadn't mattered in weeks suddenly mattered again. It was like she was circling, looking for a way in that didn't involve acknowledging the things she wanted to destroy most. That was when I realized how much restraint this was taking from her. One afternoon, I caught her standing at the edge of my yard, staring at the snowman. She didn't step onto the grass. She didn't touch it. She just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, like she was daring it to give her a reason. I stayed inside and let the cameras do their job. That night, I got an email, not a notice. An email from Brenda asking when I planned to remove the snowman. She cited safety concerns again, vaguely, without referencing any specific rule. I replied politely. I asked her to point me to the exact provision that required its removal. She didn't res. Pond. The next morning, I noticed tire tracks in the street that hadn't been there before. Fresh, heavy, the kind that came from stopping and starting abruptly. They passed right in front of my house and disappeared around the corner. The snowman was still standing. Neighbors started checking in more openly now. A man walking his dog stopped and told me it made him smile every time he passed. A teenager down the block asked if it was that snowman he'd heard about. The tension that had kept everyone quiet was loosening just a little. That made Brenda bolder. 2 nights later, the cameras caught her pulling up across the street just after midnight. She sat there for a long time, engine idling, lights off. She didn't get out. She didn't move. She just watched the snowman like it was an insult. I watched the footage the next morning and felt something close to relief. This wasn't subtle anymore. This wasn't deniable. She was choosing to be there. The following day, she showed up in person with her clipboard. She walked straight up to the snowman and circled it slowly, measuring distances that didn't matter, muttering to herself. She took photos. She didn't touch it. When she finally looked up and saw me watching from the window, her expression hardened. She wrote something down and walked away. That night I barely slept. I didn't know exactly how it would happen. I just knew it would. The waiting had stretched her patience thin. The snowman had become a challenge, a reminder that her authority wasn't absolute, and people like Brenda didn't handle that well. The morning it happened, the sky was just starting to lighten. I was already awake, coffee untouched on the counter, eyes on the yard. The snowman stood there, unchanged, innocent as ever. At 6:17 a.m., her SUV turned onto the street. She didn't slow this time. I could see it immediately, the difference in her movement, the way the vehicle lined up too perfectly with the curb. This wasn't a drive-by. This was a decision. She stopped for half a second, just long enough to aim. Then the engine roared. Time did something strange in that moment. Everything felt both too fast and too slow. I remember the spray of snow, the way the snowman collapsed forward instead of sideways, the look on her face just before impact, focused, angry, certain. And then the sound, not soft, not hollow. A hard, unmistakable crunch that didn't belong in a front yard. Her SUV lurched violently, nose-dipping, then jerking to one side. Steam burst up from the hood. The engine died. Alarms screamed into the quiet morning. She slammed on the brakes and sat there, stunned, hands still gripping the wheel. For a moment she didn't move at all. Then doors started opening up and down the street. I stepped outside slowly, keeping my hands visible, heart pounding but mind steady. The cameras caught everything. The approach, the acceleration, the impact, the immediate aftermath. Brenda climbed out of the SUV, her face pale, eyes wide. She looked from the ruined snowman to her vehicle to the gathering neighbors, like she couldn't quite process how quickly things had flipped. "What did you do?" she shouted, the question sharp and panicked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because the thing she'd driven into hadn't changed, only her assumptions had. For a few seconds after the alarm started, no one moved. The sound echoed off the houses, sharp and relentless, cutting through the quiet that had defined the neighborhood for so long. Brenda stood next to her SUV, one hand on the door, staring at the crushed remains of the snowman, like it had personally betrayed her. Steam continued to curl up from under the hood, white against the grey morning. Then reality began to catch up. A neighbor from across the street pulled out his phone. Someone else opened their front door wider and stepped onto the porch. Another voice asked, cautiously, if everyone was okay. Brenda finally looked around and seemed to realize she wasn't alone anymore. She turned toward me, eyes narrowed, and pointed at the ground. "You did something," she said, louder now, as if volume might restore control. "You sabotaged this." I kept my voice calm. I told her she had driven her vehicle into an object on my property. I told her everything else was on camera. That word, camera, hit her harder than the impact had. She looked instinctively toward the front of the house, then back at the neighbors, then down the street as if considering whether she could still leave. The SUV made a faint, unhappy clicking sound when she tried to start it again. It didn't turn over. Within minutes, someone had called it in. A police cruiser arrived first, lights flashing but siren off, followed shortly by a tow truck. The officer listened quietly as Brenda spoke over herself, explaining how the Snowman was a hazard, how she was enforcing HOA rules, how this was an act of provocation. When the officer asked why she'd accelerated into it instead of reporting it, Brenda stopped talking. The neighbors filled in tea. A silence. Not all at once, but steadily. Someone mentioned the repeated destruction. Someone else mentioned the late-night drive-bys. Another neighbor quietly said this wasn't the first time she'd seen Brenda act like this, just the first time it had gone wrong. I showed the officer the footage, not just from that morning, but from previous days. Her parking across the street, her circling the yard, her presence at odd hours. The pattern spoke for itself. The officer watched without expression, then nodded and handed my phone back. He told Brenda she would be receiving a citation for reckless driving and trespass. He also told her very plainly that HOA authority did not grant permission to damage private property. She protested, of course. She always did. But this time, the words didn't land the way they used to. There were too many witnesses, too many phones, too much documentation. As the tow truck hooked up her SUV, Brenda stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't have to. The murmurs around her said enough. By the time the truck pulled away, the street felt different, lighter, like something heavy had finally been lifted. That afternoon the notices stopped, not just for me, for everyone. Days passed without envelopes taped to doors, without emails filled with thinly veiled threats. People began leaving their trash cans out a little longer. Decorations lingered. A bench reappeared on Cecilia's porch. At the next HOA meeting, Brenda wasn't there. Instead, an email went out announcing an emergency session with the property management company present. The tone was stiff and formal, stripped of the authority Brenda usually injected into everything. When people arrived, they didn't sit in their usual silent rows. They talked to each other. I brought my notebook, so did others. The management reprise. Entative spoke carefully, choosing words like review and concern and liability. Questions were asked, real ones this time, about selective enforcement, about documentation, about authority. When Brenda finally arrived, late and visibly strained, the room didn't go quiet. She tried to speak. Someone interrupted, then another. Stories spilled out, overlapping, corroborating each other. Years of small, contained frustration finally had a place to go. When it was over, the board voted to suspend enforcement pending investigation. Brenda was asked to step down temporarily. She argued, but the vote stood. Temporary turned out to be permanent. The investigation didn't take long. Once the scrutiny started, things unraveled quickly. Improper citations, failure to follow procedure, conflicts of interest that had never been disclosed, the kind of details that don't matter until someone looks closely and then matter a great deal. Brenda resigned before she could be formally removed. The HOA didn't dissolve immediately, but it changed. New leadership was elected. Policies were clarified. Appeals were handled by people who didn't already have their minds made up. The fines I'd paid were refunded. So were many others. More importantly, the fear receded. My daughter noticed it before I did. She asked if she could draw with chalk again. When I said yes, she ran outside and filled the sidewalk with color like she'd been holding it all in. No one came to erase it. The next snowfall, she asked if we could build another snowman. We did. This one had a scarf, and buttons, and a crooked smile that made her laugh. Neighbors stopped to admire it. Someone added a hat when we weren't looking. It stood for days untouched. Brenda moved away not long after. No announcement, no goodbye. Her house went up for sale and sold quietly. The SUV never came back. Sometimes people ask me if I planned it all from the beginning, if the snowman was some kind of trap. The truth is simpler and harder to explain. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the harassment to stop. I wanted my daughter to feel safe creating something joyful without worrying it'd be taken away. The snowman was never the point. It was just the thing that revealed everything else. What Brenda didn't understand was that power only works when people believe in it, when they stay quiet, when they assume they're alone. All I did was stop assuming that. On the first warm day of spring, the last of the snow melted away, leaving the yard bare again. My daughter asked what we'd do next winter. I told her we'd build as many snowmen as we wanted, and this time I knew they'd stay standing.